everyone. It is July 23rd, 2020, and this is Mediation, the New Possibilities Hour with our special guest, Claire Plotkin of YourNextJury.com. We're here to raise money for food banks. This is part of the Will Work for Food project organized by Natalie Armstrong. There's no charge for these valuable webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank of your choice if you like what you see. Today, Claire's the particular food bank that Claire would like us to mention is the Holy Family Giving Bank of South Pasadena, California. It's particularly important to Claire. She grew up attending this church every week and went to the Holy Family School for 9 years. Volunteering at and donating to this food bank was an important part of Claire's childhood and her life. The website for the Holy Family Food Bank is holyfamily.org/giving-bank/. That's holyfamily.org/giving-bank/. So if you like the presentation, and I bet you will, please make a contribution to the Holy Family Giving Bank of South Pasadena or any other food bank that's important to you and your local community, so that we can all help to address the serious issue of food insecurity in our society at this challenging time. Now a word about our special guest, Claire Plotkin. She is a jury consultant based in Los Angeles, California, handles cases in a wide geographic scope of venues. She's worked on over 100 jury trials. She's a former collegiate athlete, which means she's highly competitive and prides herself on picking jurors for challenging cases. She and her company, Your Next Jury, work primarily on the plaintiff side, although some on the defense side as well. And Claire is very fortunate to be able to work with her husband, a fellow jury consultant, Harry Plotkin, in YourNextJury.com. They've worked together for many years, and they like to say they work tirelessly to help plaintiffs get the justice that they deserve. So Claire, we're very happy to have you here today because, particularly as mediators and as lawyers as well, when we talk about settlement, we're always asking compared to what? And the what is, what will a jury do? Compared to what? How does this settlement stack up compared to the likely outcome in court? And the momentous events of 2020 seem to be changing juries as well. How could they not? So I'd like to start. I've got a bunch of questions, so why don't we start with that? And then we'll open it up to questions from others. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to ask what they wish and to make sure that you, Claire, have the opportunity to share everything that's important to you. So,
sounds good.
Okay, so first, Claire, let's talk about the physical aspects of jury service. What will the physical aspects of jury service be like as you see them going forward? And how will that impact what will juries do? Let's start with that as we go down the path of how can we help people evaluate the alternative to a negotiated settlement?
Well, I think physically, I think most jury selections will start online for the jurors that actually can. I think a good portion of voir dire will be done via Zoom, actually, which is an interesting phenomenon, but I think is good because then we can navigate the whole idea of jurors being uncomfortable in tight spaces altogether. But of course, the problem with online is that there will be a section of the juror population that just simply cannot be reached via computer, internet, whether because they don't have the resources, and so then those jurors, I think the plan going forward is to have those jurors attend in person with a mask, socially distanced. And I think that's the plan as of right now, for Los Angeles, at least for their jury trials. And then, so we would have a portion online, a portion in person. So it would definitely require some patience on the judge's side and patience for the jurors, and a lot of sort of navigating this very different world for lawyers. But I think the way, if we do it this way, I think we'll have a lot happier jury pool, because at least they will feel like they are being accommodated. Because I think the great worry we have with the lawyers right now is that we will have a huge group of jurors who come in who feel like they're being shuttled into court against their will, and they're angry about jury selection. So I think by us at least accommodating them in this early process, I think jurors will feel more willing and more listened to, with their fears about being jurors. I
So,
think it's like,
go ahead.
so I was going
Go
to say,
ahead.
I think it's likely that the amount of retention of jurors that we have from the hardship phase will be, I think we'll retain way fewer. I think that's what we're expecting, that we will have many. And I think the biggest hurdle I see going forward, that of course is no one can really project what's going to happen, is what will happen with schools. Because I think that if we are still having enforced distance learning for a majority of kids, I think we will lose a lot of primary parents. I think that would probably mean a lot of moms. So, which is sort of a crazy aspect, a crazy prospect to think of not having moms on your juries. But, if parents are being asked to be babysitters and do their job and be jurors, I think that would be very hard. And I can see a lot of judges being very lenient with hardship to parents who are saying, I have kids who can't stay at home alone at my house right now. So I think that's a great problem with hardship going forward, that we really can't like predict until we get there. Because if you think about it, and I know this is what would happen in my house, most of us don't have we don't have nannies working or grandparents taking care of the kids because of COVID. So it's very unusual situation, but I definitely think that judges will have to be more lenient with hardships going forward, for the simple aspect of there's no one else to watch them. So
is this going to make some kinds of cases more valuable, less valuable, some kinds of cases more important to settle, embolden plaintiffs or defendants? Do you think this will shake out in any systematic kind of way?
I think that when all is said and done, a jury, you could still seat a really good plaintiff-friendly jury. And, and I think that you could still have really great verdicts coming out of it. I think that, and we did a little research on this, I can actually refer. I think that for the most part, people will just be a little more polarized with their views. So I think that people who may have been pro-plaintiff may actually be even more so in a lot of ways. And people who might be angry at the system, angry about this whole thing might be even worse. So, as you can see, I think tensions are just sort of at a boiling point among the population in general, and people are becoming much more extreme in their views. And I see that sort of doing the same thing, in jury selection. So, I think like a lawyer who knows what they're doing in jury selection might actually be able to get a lot more jurors perhaps off for cause, because maybe jurors are more, entrenched in their beliefs and a little more angry. So, or on the flip side, perhaps a little more of a bleeding heart at this moment, so it's going to have to, I think jury selection is going to require a lot more finesse by the attorneys, and so we don't just lose everybody. I think if you think about it, lawyers like to say that, I like to say that a good jury is not that would give a good verdict, is not a jury that would feel sympathetic to your client. It's actually a jury that would get angry at the misconduct of the defendant. And people are so angry right now. It could really be a great environment for a high verdict, right? If you had the right jury. So I think that you could definitely, I think the thinking a few months ago was, don't try a case, you won't get any money, because everybody's been so affected by COVID, nobody wants to give anything. And I don't really think that's the case at all. So, I mean, I could see how you could get a terrible jury if you don't do it well, but I think that it could be ripe for good verdicts.
So since you sometimes work on the defense side of the aisle,
Mhm.
let me ask you to flip that coin over to the other side and tell us what you might say to a defense lawyer if
Oh,
the defense
sure.
lawyer were asking you.
Um, I would say, I would not, if I were a defense lawyer, the one area I would be very hesitant to take to trial right now would be a police brutality case. I think that, especially in Los Angeles, I would think that the population trends way more towards anti-police than pro-police at this point. But but you can still, the people who are very pro-police would be very outspoken. But I definitely think that the environment is very tough for that right now.
Mhm.
But I do think, you know, maybe I would think that if you have a lower level damage case, like not a wrongful death or like a really serious injury, but like, I don't know, a minor TBI or something, I don't think there's really anything wrong with taking it to trial right now. I think you could. And I think that, I just like we were talking about yesterday, Jeff, I do think that jurors might be a little more skeptical perhaps about some of the maybe less, less extreme injuries, but I mean, I think perhaps it still is a little bit harder for the plaintiff in this time period right now than for the defendant. So that's probably what I would say. But to be aware that there are quite a few jurors out there who are fully ready and willing to go to bat, for the plaintiff. So that's what I would say to the defendant, probably.
Okay, okay. So there are two big overarching issues in society right now, Claire, and it's the impact of COVID-19 and
Mhm.
racial issues. And
Mhm.
of course, we're probably not going to see jury trials for many months into
Right.
2021. That's why we titled this The Civil Jury in 2021 rather than 2020, because we're
Right.
not going to see civil juries in 2020.
Right.
But I'd like to go into some detail, please. What are the impacts of COVID-19 and all of its implications, the health implications, the economic
Mhm.
repercussions on society? I'd like to talk about how those are going to play out in the jury system, and then talk about the racial unrest and racial tensions in our society and how that plays out. So where would you like to start, please?
So let me parse this question. I think I'll start with the first part. And I actually thought, just coincidentally, unrelated to this, my husband and I did a survey just a few days ago because we were hoping to start doing some in-person mock trials, actually, of jurors. And we profiled a bunch of jurors who just answered just in the last several days, so not months ago, just in the last several days, about whether or not they would attend in-person focus group. And then we asked them about whether or not they would attend in-person jury duty. And I thought that this was really helpful for today because I think a lot of us have some great worries about what a jury would actually look like in this post-COVID era. I know a lot of lawyers have been worried that a jury would be all 20-year-olds, like 20 to 35, because they seem, at least according to the news, they seem to be sort of not worried about COVID. They're not old enough to feel like they're in sort of harm of catching and being seriously ill, and for a lot of lawyers, that makes them very nervous. Millennial jurors are not. It's interesting, not really preferred by either side. I find that very interesting that both sides seem to be very scared of millennial jurors. But as I often play the chicken during jury selection, let's see who's going to strike this millennial first, But so I found that our results were very interesting. So the kinds of questions we asked these jurors, and keep in mind, these are the jurors who would sign up online to group in the first place. So a little skewed. You know, perhaps there are some people who wouldn't even consider signing online for a focus group. So maybe those people might be a little less willing to go to court, but we'll talk about it anyway. But anyway, so we asked them, would you be comfortable and willing to serve? Or would you report for jury duty and then try to get out? Those kinds of questions. And 54% of jurors surveyed said they would feel comfortable serving. 54%, which I actually thought that it could be something like 15 to 20%. I mean, I really thought it could be as low as that. And 21% said they would feel uncomfortable or unsafe. 20% said they would plead hardship. So I find that not a shocking number at all. I mean, in jury selection before COVID, we'd have at least 20% plead hardship. So that, and then, but what's really interesting is we did a demographic breakdown of who said they would be willing to serve. And that's what I found the most interesting. Jurors who were willing to serve were actually older than average. Okay, so it wasn't a person, it wasn't, you know, our 20-year-olds were willing to serve. It was actually younger jurors were more willing to claim hardship. 64.5% of jurors in their 60s were willing to serve.
In person.
Yes, in person. Once we got to 70s, the number changed. But 60s, I found that very interesting. Jurors in their 50s were 60% willing to serve. Jurors in their 40s were 53.8% willing. And then jurors in their 30s were 51% willing. Jurors in their 70s were only 50% willing. So we went down almost 15%, right, from 60s to 70s, which doesn't surprise me. Actually, I would have thought 70s would have been lower. And then, but yet, jurors in their 20s were only 33% willing to serve. Found that very interesting. It seemed actually like jurors in their 20s were more willing to claim hardship. So, you know, I mean, if you think about it, when in your 20s, most 20-year-olds have amassed very little to any personal, you know, wealth. So, and probably living more paycheck to paycheck. And so I could see how a lot of them would be hurting financially by COVID. So this like danger group of 20 to 29, actually very few of them were willing to serve. So I found that very interesting. And just like we expected going into this, men were more willing to serve than women. 56.7% of men versus 52% of women. But it's not, you know, 70 to 30, which was what I was worried was going to be. So I was surprised by that as well. And then what was interesting too was the ethnic breakdown of who was willing to serve. And Jeff and I talked about this yesterday. And Jeff, you know, since we talked about it, the information changed. I had several more jurors respond and it changed. It flipped. Because Jeff had asked if certain demographics that were perhaps more negatively affected by COVID were less willing to serve. And so Jeff, Hispanic jurors were the most willing to serve. 64% of Hispanic jurors were willing to serve. And Caucasians, 61%. However, Asians and African Americans were much lower. Asians were 41% willing to serve, and African Americans were 35%. So, Jeff, you had guessed that African Americans would be less willing. You were right. The numbers changed significantly as of yesterday, actually, because before yesterday, there was no significant difference in African Americans being willing to serve. But then we had several more sign up who said they were not willing. So, I found that interesting. And then, crazily enough, jurors who identified as other, only 30% of them were willing to serve. So I don't know what in their, you know, mindset causes them to identify as other that perhaps makes them a little more, maybe, I don't know, maybe more liberal, I'm not sure, but a little more different, but only 30% of others were willing to serve. So this is not scientific or anything to, you know, hang your hat on, but I thought it was very interesting because we have so little information right now on what a jury pool is going to look like that, anyway, I just thought you all might find that interesting.
So, Claire, the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about the willingness of people in their 60s is, I just got to say, okay, boomer. I think that's great. But the second thing is, given what you've said about age and race and ethnicity and all that, those are I think, the archetypes of the more conservative, more defense-oriented jurors,
The
where
six jurors in their 60s?
older, um, and with what you've said about gender and race and ethnicity, I think those are some of the traditional stereotypes of the more pro-defense jurors. Where are the pro-plaintiff? Maybe I'm wrong, but where are the more pro-plaintiff jurors gonna come from with those kind of
You
statistics?
know, I actually, well, um, I don't quite agree. I mean,
Okay.
I've had some amazing jurors in their 60s. I think that yes, 60-year-olds can be more conservative. However, 60-year-olds also have more life experience, especially like in an employment case. I would take a 60-year-old juror who's had an amazing employment background, who's worked for one employer for 25 years and has only been treated well. I would take that person. Like that could be a really good juror, as opposed to a 25-year-old who's had 6 different employers and has no sense of career passion or anything. You know what I mean? Because if you have an unemployment plaintiff who lost their job after working somewhere for 40 years and could never find another job, and their job was their life, an older juror can understand that, and that resonates with them. A younger juror is like, you can find a new job in 2 seconds, So I don't necessarily feel like a 60-year-old juror is worse. I mean, a 60-year-old white man who hates lawsuits and who is angry at people who think they deserve money. Okay, well, yeah, I know I don't want that guy. But I mean, these statistics don't necessarily tell me that. I mean, so I don't know. I think I'm hesitant to make any juror suppositions based on demographics alone, because I feel like everybody is different and everyone's life experiences are different. But I still would be nervous about a jury that was all 20-year-olds. I would. So that we can all agree on that one, I think.
Okay, now let's turn to the very sensitive topic of race, the racial unrest and tensions in our society, and how you think that will play out in terms of what juries will look like, and the important question for us as mediators and lawyers, how we go about valuing cases and deciding whether or not we want to settle them or take them to trial.
Well, I think that especially in a very socially conscious, more liberal area like Los Angeles, I think that people are just becoming even more aware of acceptance of people of color, the plights of people with color, and I think they're even more sensitive to all of the disadvantages that someone of color has, growing up just from the moment they're born, right? And so I think that certain kinds of cases, like perhaps let's think a case where it's terrible housing, with some sort of maybe tenant slumlord kind of thing where they're sort of preying on people of color, like that kind of case could be, that could be really dangerous to take to trial right now. Like I said before, police brutality, that I would be very nervous to take that kind of case to trial. Maybe some sort of employment dispute where someone is very clearly is showing a pattern of, I don't want to say racism, but perhaps, taking advantage of employees of color, or for that matter, sex harassment right now is still a very big deal. But the Me Too movement has not blown over yet. I think you do have quite a few jurors who are very angry at the Me Too movement, but in my experience in the past few years, the amount of awareness and education of the jury regarding the Me Too movement, and the amount of jurors that you say stuff like, when you ask a question like, who here thinks that if you didn't report sexual harassment right away, that it must not have happened. The amount of jurors who say absolutely not, victims don't report because they're afraid of retaliation. The amount of comments like that in jury selection now is 3 times the amount of comments I got probably 5 years ago. So there's definitely a much more pro victim, and societal impact than there was 5-10 years ago. And so I would definitely say, obviously people understand that if you don't have facts, if you don't have evidence, they won't just give you a verdict, right? But they're much more willing to be open to believe in a victim than I think they were in the past. So that's something to think about. I would say also, if there's a case that has any sort of incriminating video, I think jurors right now are very, very aware and very attuned to any sort of video evidence. So whereas I think cases where it's just he said, she said are in some ways harder now because jurors, their immediate reaction is everybody here has a cell phone camera, or there's cameras on intersections, that kind of stuff. So if this happened, there would be video evidence, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely a lot that I've seen in my own experience in the past. Because I was picking juries up until literally, I think about March 12th, maybe. So I had 3 trials that got stopped mid-trial because of COVID. So I was picking trials up until we could not anymore. And then that's what I've seen. So does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yes, it does. So let me ask you, Claire, are there other obvious things that are obvious to you that lawyers just tend not to notice for whatever blind spots that we have? What else can you open our eyes to that we might just be missing because we're lawyers and we're not psychologists?
So with regards to how jurors perceive cases,
valuing cases, how do juries perceive cases, helping people evaluate the alternative to settlement, which is going to trial. What do lawyers tend to miss that psychologists and jury professionals like yourself you seem surprised that we miss so regularly?
Well, the thing I just said is probably the first important one that comes to my mind, which is the importance and the value of more than just a he said, she said, he said, she said case. I mean, if a plaintiff only has, he did this to me, and there's very little to back it up, that's still, it's, regardless of how extreme the examples are, it still is hard for a lot of jurors to truly value that, without having at least some sort of what they would call, an unbiased, someone else who can give corroborating evidence, that doesn't have skin in the game, And so that's definitely something jurors always look for. It's very hard for jurors to decide cases on just one person talking, and without any actual, written evidence, photographic evidence, or, another employee who said, I saw this too, that kind of thing. That's very hard. I would say another thing that I think lawyers overestimate is how I think that let me rephrase. I think that lawyers tend to overestimate how much jurors will just decide a case based on their client, which I don't think is the case. I mean, I think a bad client can hurt you, but if you were to make a case just telling only your client's story and not make it about the damaging things that the defendant has done, a juror isn't all in. You know what I mean? I think just like I said earlier, juries decide cases based on anger and less on sympathy. So cause I've seen lawyers do openings where the first 5-10 minutes of the opening is talking about what a wonderful person their plaintiff is. And I think that's totally backwards. You should really talk about all the things the defendant did wrong and then bring in what a wonderful person your plaintiff is, because it almost seems like you're asking for sympathy. And jurors don't like feeling like they're being manipulated, so that is like the first thing I would say. But then on the flip side, I think that defendants will often underestimate how terrible their defendant's performance looks, and you have to be very careful with when lawyers ignore or sort of discount these potentially very egregious actions and then jurors can get really angry about, so. And I also would say defense attorneys have to be very careful, and I feel like I see this a lot. They have to be very careful with making comments about plaintiffs that I think they are. It's sort of like a smearing a plaintiff's character, but you have to be very careful about that because they can backfire in that you just look like a really terrible person making these arguments about a plaintiff. So that's something I would say. You always have to be, there's a very fine line,
Are you referring to sexual harassment cases where?
That's a good example.
Yeah.
Where you sort of, for the lack of a better word, slut shame, the plaintiff, there's definitely, I think that a lawyer is always more successful the more respectful and polite they seem. I think the moment you start to kind of be super negative and derogatory, I think it sort of brings your case down, so there's always, unless of course you have a jury that is completely on your side. But if for any jury that is sort of not decided and you start to be that angry, offensive lawyer, I think it really, let me give you an example.
Please.
I had a case in Ventura that actually we had prevailed in with a $13 million verdict in Ventura for sexual assault. And the lawyer, it was almost like as if the defense lawyer almost had like either a strike out or hit a home run mentality, So he went full, his mini opening was all about, these women were in a consensual relationship with this mental hospital employee. They wanted this. He was, they were in a time of need. That was his closing said, these women were in a time of need because they were mentally ill and he helped them through it because he was having sexual relationships. They were under 5150s at a psych facility. And one of our jurors who was actually impaneled was someone who'd been in a 5150 before. And so talk about not knowing your audience. To tell a bunch of jurors, including someone who had been in a mental health facility before, that this employee was helping them through their time of need by engaging in sexual acts against their will. That is, if you had a bunch of jurors who felt the same way he did, I could see that working. Otherwise, it's a complete strikeout, right? Jeff, I can see the look on your face.
Yeah,
you're thinking, how on earth would you say that? Right.
Yeah.
Right. But he was sort of going all in on, they'll find these women, sort of crazy and perhaps lower level people in society because he went all in on the past drug use, past mental health episodes, children out of wedlock. So I think he was just sort of thinking like they'll see these women as just complete, useless people, and they'll agree with my points. But that's not how our jury was. Our jury was actually a bunch of almost all men, which was interesting, but a jury of a bunch of very thoughtful and fatherly. So when you have young women, they were all young women. So a bunch of thoughtful, fatherly males who were very offended, and that just lit a match on the whole thing to make that kind of argument in trial. So you have to be very careful with the incendiary arguments like that because they backfire more than help, I think. So.
Wow. So Claire, you also mentioned lawyers missing the idea or missing the point of their client being a bad witness or putting in a
Right,
bad performance.
right.
What are the kinds of blind, and we as mediators, we're generally speaking lawyers too. What are the blind spots, the points that we tend to miss? Why do we miss them, whether we're evaluating a plaintiff or a defendant? And what can we do about opening our eyes wider so that we don't miss some of these obvious
Yeah.
flaws and come to better evaluations of how things will turn out if people don't settle?
Well, I would say this. I think that any bad client, be it defendant or plaintiff, can always benefit from some prepping, so you can always make, I think for the most part, you can always make a poorly performing client look better, but
Yes,
you know, you
but
can't.
your point, but excuse me, your point was that we often miss or don't appreciate how bad they are in the first
Right,
place.
it's true. Like, for example, here's a bad plaintiff that I see a lot, and I think lawyers think they can kind of just gloss over, but it's the plaintiff who is trying to run the show. Okay, and you see it all the time, right? So they're constantly trying to tell their lawyer what to do. They are taking notes through everything. They think they know better, right? And then so when it comes to being on the stand, they don't listen. They're not going to listen to what they've been asked to answer. They think they know what the answer is, and so they kind of go off the rails, you know. And the worst part of that client is they don't really seem very honest, you know. And they also, jurors are always looking for that. They're always wary. There's always that back of the mind that there's a plaintiff out there who might be just trying to game the system, right? So the more you look as if you are sitting there on your lawyer's shoulder and sort of pulling the strings, there should never be a client who looks like they're pulling the strings in the back of trial, ever, never, ever, ever. And so the first thing jurors think is, what are they hiding? What are they trying to hide? All this over explanation, all this whispering, like, what is going on that I don't see? And then they become skeptical, right? So that's never a good client from a plaintiff's perspective. And I see it a lot, and sometimes you have to pull the lawyer aside and I have to say, this is not going to go over well in trial. And maybe you should consider not taking this client to trial. So, I mean, and it's true and it's sad, but it is, and they don't ever appear as nearly as sympathetic, or, and jurors aren't as empathetic to them as you would hope. So that's always a really negative client.
And then what advice would you have for how to break the bad news gently to this client who seems to be lacking in self-awareness in the first place?
Well, sometimes I think that you have to truly do them. They have to know honestly and truthfully, because they have no idea. Most of these people, unless they're a serial plaintiff, which is a whole nother problem, but most of these people have no idea what they're coming into in trial, and they have no idea how a juror perceives them. So I will be honest, and you and blunt without being rude, but you have to say something like, if you keep up this behavior, you will get nothing. This is not helping your case. And sometimes somebody who's not the lawyer, like for example me, and you can say, oh, this person is an expert on juries, blah blah blah, is better because sometimes they're too close to their lawyer at that point, But another way I found helpful is videotaping them and then playing it back. Like, look at these things that you are doing. In that same vein, we've done that before with defendants. I've prepped CEOs, CFOs, engineers for like corporate cases, for example. And we've done witness prep mostly for the sake of showing them video of themselves and saying, look how bad you look. Look at what you are doing. Look at what you are saying, the way that you think you are leading these answers. Being like the CEO of the boardroom is not helping in trial, right? Nobody wants to help the know-it-all, right? And sometimes the video is the first like aha moment for them. I mean, I remember I had one CEO who was sitting there, and he was like a pretty nice CEO with just talking to him. The moment the camera came on and he started talking about the actual facts of the case, he had like this Cornell ring that he kept putting up in front of his face. You know, he'd sit there behind his ring, and it was almost like I can't explain, almost like a Dr. Evil moment, you know? And he was kind of like sitting there grimacing at the camera. And it was awful, awful. And we had to play back, I mean, probably a day's worth of practicing questions, playing it back and going, look at you. You know, everything that you're doing is wrong. It doesn't matter what intention you had going into trial right now, you're giving all the wrong signals, right? So, I mean, sometimes showing is the best and easiest way to persuade somebody, because especially for somebody who isn't really fully listening, if you can then show them video of themselves, I mean, they can't, unless they're completely delusional, you can't deny what you're seeing right in front of you, right? So, or another option, you could always focus group a client. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And I could see as a mediator how you might even want to suggest that sometimes. Like, oh, you know, so-and-so plaintiff wants this much money. They're not even close to what the defendant would be willing to offer. I think you need to find a quick and dirty and perhaps cheapish way to focus group this client in front of jurors and have a real group of 12 jurors say, I can't stand this person. And then maybe they'll have a come to Jesus moment, and that would encourage settlement. I mean, I've done it many times, and it's interesting how persuasive it is.
So Claire, sometimes as mediators, we are the focus group. We are
Right.
are the one. And sometimes you're sitting there as a mediator, and I always have to ask myself when I'm having a negative reaction to somebody, is it just because they remind me of my middle school algebra teacher, or is there something really objectively bad about this person that will strike other people or potential jurors the same way it's striking me? So
Right.
what advice would you have to us as mediators or as lawyers evaluating a client, whether it's just something personal to ourselves, you know, you remind me of somebody in my life who I didn't like, for example, versus more general lack of likability? How do we gut check ourselves for that? And then if we persuade ourselves that, no, this person really is going to antagonize everybody, what are things or approaches that we as mediators or lawyers might take in a one-on-one situation to break the bad news in a way that is actually effective with the person who is engaging in this conduct?
Okay. First of all, I think if you're having a visceral negative reaction to somebody, I think it's more likely than not something that someone else will feel as well. And I think that it's probably not just your middle school algebra teacher. And if it is your middle school algebra teacher, probably every single person has had another nasty middle school algebra teacher that they can also remember, you know, that also this person might call to mind to them as well. So, I mean, I think unless you're a really clueless person about people, which there are people who are like that, I think if you have a visceral negative reaction, most people are feeling similarly. And you could always, you know, call in a receptionist or something, have them listen for 2 seconds and see if they feel similarly. But often people are all feeling the same negative way about somebody, right? For even if they can't particularly put their finger on why they dislike or like somebody, you know, there are people who come across as warm and wonderful, and there are people who come across as nasty, right? I mean, that's just the truth. And especially if you're bringing a case to trial, you want to be more on the warm and wonderful side, you know? So in terms of what kind of advice to give to somebody who really comes across terribly, there are a couple ways to handle it. First of all, you can really, if the person is that terrible, but the facts of the case are that great, you just really minimize that person. If anything, you do them last, you know, like make this wonderful case without even involving their personality, you know? So the jurors are already angry by the time they sit down, right? So that would probably be my first tip if you were actually going to trial with this person. If it was really, I mean, I'm thinking back. I had one case where actually it never even went forward, and I think since then the client has actually changed counsel again. So the lawyers that hired me are now not even retained on the case, but this client was just really, really, really rough. The kind of like client that nobody wants, where they email them 15 times every night because they're working on their own case at night, and emailing the lawyers and expecting the lawyers to respond first thing in the day, right? That kind of client. And you know, you just we just did that. We did a focus group of her because there was no other way. She wasn't going to listen to her lawyers. She thought she knew better. I mean, when she met me, she had to have a meeting with me alone without the lawyers involved to decide that if she liked me enough to hire me. I mean, she's just that kind of person, you know? So yeah, we weren't going to do anything persuasive. It had to be a bunch of jurors who would be, and we had to say, this is the venue. This is what your jurors are like. This is what they think. And you have them watch the whole focus group, and you have them watch them deliberate. She watches them deliberate, and here's the negative or positive things that they say about her, you know? And that's just, and it's just the medicine that you have to take, you know? And sometimes it's really hard for them to hear, but you know, it's how else are you gonna persuade them at all? I don't think it's really possible if they don't trust your opinion for you to persuade them. So some sort of objective non-party has to persuade them.
Yes, and often as the mediator, we step into those shoes, and
Right.
your tips in that regard are very, very helpful. We're so glad you're here. Thank you so much.
I think
All
so too.
around.
Yeah.
This has been an absolutely incredible hour. Thanks to all of you who participated, all of you who were here. Claire, your presentation was just fantastic. Thank you so much for being here and for lending your time and support to the Will Work for Food project. I want to mention once again the Holy Family Food Bank. That's holyfamily.org/giving-back/. And Natalie, thank you so much for organizing the overall Will Work for Food project. We're over $40,000 now. Is that right, for food banks around the world?
Jeff, we are actually now over $43,000
Wow.
for the Will Work for Food.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Thank you. The legal industry and mediators, arbitrators, neutrals around the world have been incredibly generous, Claire, incredibly generous.
That's wonderful.
That's fantastic. So thanks to all of you for supporting food banks. Thanks to all of you for being here. Claire, thanks for allowing us to record this. We'll be posting this. We'll be posting this up on social media so that more people can hear of it and support the Holy Family Food Bank and other food banks of their choice. And with that, thank you very much. We are complete.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.